Well, hey, friends, welcome back to How to Eat an Elephant. As I was preparing today's reading, you two, it was so enthralling. It was so plot oriented, so full of imagery that I was moved to seek a film adaptation to witness. And it turns out in 1970, a movie entitled Waterloo came out, and it has a 27% on Rotten Tomatoes. 27.
Whoa.
Roger Ebert's review of this film is like 4 paragraphs long, which is less than half his usual length for a film review.
Oh man.
Gives it 2 stars and basically just tears it a new one. I mean,
Oh no.
So apparently there's a gaping hole in the film adaptation scene of our era, and somebody needs to pick it up and do it, because what an enthralling section. Did you guys not feel like you were watching a movie reading this?
Oh, I definitely did. There were it was so violent as we were reading, and I was so engaged with the reading that I had to take a break and put my head between my knees. I was like, oh, I think I'm gonna be sick.
So Megan doesn't like blood. Very good.
I
Emily, what
don't-
did
I
you
don't like
think?
I thought it was good. I also was surprised. I had prepared myself for a Tolstoy level slog and was
Yes.
surprised to find that it was not too bad. It
I
was
felt-
actually kind of, nice.
It read much more like a dramatization of a battle than a dry historical retelling, like much more like Killer Angels. Have you guys
Yeah.
read that?
Yeah, oh man.
It was. I
Great
thought of
It
that
comparison.
reminded me a lot of that.
Yeah.
The Battle of Bunker Hill scene came to mind a lot.
Although I have to say, as a reader, my number one challenge has always been picturing geographical descriptions.
Oh yeah.
And I'm getting better at it as I get older, but I really struggle with when they're like, on the western side there was a hillock and an undulating plain, but there was an escarpment on the
Yeah.
I can't visualize. It's horrible.
Didn't you think the capital A image that he used was helpful though? Like
Yeah.
I've never seen someone do that before. And letters, I got.
Yeah.
Letters we can do.
It helps. But don't you get stressed out? Maybe this is just me, and maybe this is just revealing of my personal anxiety levels, but I get really stressed out by I kept going back to that paragraph to
Mhm.
make sure I knew where each city was on the A.
This is Emily for you, ladies and gentlemen. She's exact. She's precise. She's historical. I'm like,
But that's
capital A, I got
actually
this.
It's kind of a handicap to being a historian, though, not being able to picture maps.
Yeah,
Good
no
point.
kidding. You need that, it turns out. Now, I thought the A imagery was really helpful. Also, it helps me to remember that when a guy is describing a battle like this in prose, west is left, east is right, north is
Yeah,
straight
you have
ahead.
to picture it like
It's
a compass rose.
Yeah.
Oh,
And
I
that
see.
helps a ton. But either way, though, I agree with you guys. This felt like it felt narrative
Mhm.
enough to keep me really, really engaged. There was some beautiful imagery we'll talk about a little bit later. I know Megan has thoughts on the nature imagery in contrast with the battle imagery. But I want to start with the Tolstoy comparison, because
Yeah.
we just finished War and Peace at great personal cost.
Yeah.
And there was another important Napoleon moment. I mean, there were Napoleon moments throughout, but we got Austerlitz in War and Peace, right? And that was also a pretty detailed battle narration. How does it compare? What do you guys think?
Well, I love that I know that we have a lot of people joining us who they weren't with us for War and Peace.
Right.
So I don't want to wax
Give
too
me a couple of
it,
sentences on Tolstoy's version, though. Like, how does he undertake to write a battle like this?
Well, I'm going to leave that to you. What I was going to say is that I thought it was fun that in this section, Hugo says that the sun rose at Austerlitz for Napoleon, and here at Waterloo, the sun set. And so, because we just read War and Peace, I thought it was kind of a fun bookend to that experience.
It may even be part of the reason we chose.
Yeah. I mean, it's just the fact that Napoleon features as a character and the way that Hugo characterizes him. I was like, oh yeah, I know this guy. I've met him before.
Yeah.
There must be some truth to what Napoleon was like, because I recognize this character from War and Peace.
Megan, what about you? How would you characterize the difference between these two authors and the way they write a Napoleon battle? I suppose there is actually a word for that. Napoleonic.
Yeah, Napoleonic
use
battle. I actually thought there were a lot of similarities in the way that they describe a battle, because with Tolstoy, what we noticed is him vacillating wildly between a historical philosophy and really personal, up close, experiential moments with characters. And the same thing seems to be happening here in Tolstoy's attempt to get us close to the battle. He says on at the end of chapter, I guess it's chapter 3 of our section for today, he says, we leave the historians to their struggle. We are merely a distant witness, a passerby on the plain, a researcher bending over this ground steeped in human flesh, perhaps taking appearances for realities. But that's not our experience with the rest of his story. We get very close and personal, so close and personal with the events that I felt sick to my stomach. So he is trying to do both things that Tolstoy was doing, present us with a reading of history and show us what it was like, bring those ghosts in the land back again so that we can experience the conflict with them.
One difference I think that is really helpful is that Hugo makes himself a character on the scene in a way that Tolstoy kind of speaks as God. God as narrator. He's the authoritative voice presenting us, or like just stating his argument, because this scene opens with Hugo traveling himself to the battlefield in 1861. It's a little more measured. We know that it's Hugo who's arguing. He's not, I mean, he is speaking authoritatively, but from his own voice.
That's a good point.
Does that make sense?
Yes, it really does. Even that last line that I just read, perhaps taking appearances for realities. There is a humility in that sentence that I don't think we would have found in Tolstoy. He says, here's what I can perceive, and this may not be what actually happened, but this is what I see. Here's what we think. He uses the we a lot. Here's what we think, but we weren't there. And in the end, he ends his historical philosophy, and this may be stealing someone's thunder, but it seems to me that Hugo comes down on the side of providence guiding these events rather than either mere chance or the actions of a great man. He said it's a little bit of everything, but mostly it's a providential hand. It's destiny that makes this battle end this way.
Yeah, I love that. And it's definitely true, it's a little bit more pleasing. And I don't know that the two authors would have disagreed with each other, really, but Tolstoy's multiplicity of causes is sort of mirrored here and then sharpened into a point and humanized, or not humanized, deified, I suppose, but given a face in the hand of God, who has decided that Napoleon has enough already, dude. But I do think, and we were talking about this before we got on the air, I picked up a humorous note underneath the surface, and I think Hugo's probably aware of it. I don't think he would have left it in unless he wanted his readers to be in on the joke. But among competitive types, maybe even particularly among competitive men, when it comes to games of strategy or of strength, especially if there's a little bit of chance involved in the game itself, and you lose, you will do anything in your power to convince the room that the element of chance is the only thing that has overcome you. Your opponent's strategy may have been good. It may even have been as good as yours, but it was not better. I promise, because that is not how we do. We do not admit such things. And I can see Hugo doing a little bit of that. I'm overstating for the sake of the joke, but when he talks about Wellington and Napoleon, and he compares the two generals, he talks about Wellington as the tactician, but Napoleon as the genius.
Which is kind of the opposite of the way Tolstoy set the terms, right? Napoleon was the strategic genius who tried to work within the rules, and Kutuzov was the working on inspiration, in tune with instinct general.
Right.
Although,
go ahead, Megan.
Well, there's another phrase that Hugo hews to, if I may use that phrase, which I will repeat. That was fun. But he hews to this phrase, giants of action. He calls Napoleon a genius of the ideal and a giant of action. And that seems to be in contrast with what Tolstoy was highlighting as what makes you a genius. That I think Tolstoy would say a genius is one who's capable of inaction, of allowing things to take their course. And Hugo says a genius or a giant is based on what he does, and it's impotent in the face of destiny. Maybe they're making slightly different points.
Yeah, I think so.
Maybe they are. Yeah, I hadn't gone quite so far as to connect the observation about his essential Frenchness to that observation about his historical philosophy. He's very French, though. This Hugo.
He's very
well.
Very
I mean,
French.
how else do you manage to get through a very, very deep? I mean, clearly he's done a lot of research, a very detailed analysis of the Battle of Waterloo, and call it a victory for France. That is beyond me.
Well, he's one of the interesting things to keep in mind is that he's in a very delicate position, whereas Tolstoy was arguing for the essential Russianness of Kutuzov, and the fact that it really did end up leading to Napoleon's downfall at Austerlitz, even though more so Borodino, right? The Russians technically lost, but in reality they won because of the outcome. Here we have a different situation in which to be French at the time that Hugo is writing is to be a little confused about your own allegiances.
No kidding.
When it comes to the Battle of Waterloo in particular, at the time that Hugo is writing, the Bourbons have been restored. Or I guess he was writing after the next monarch took the throne, but a monarchy has been restored.
Right.
And Napoleon, even though he says, he represents this kind of gaping hole in French identity that they're trying to fill, that they're kind of, because he fell, they're secretly attracted to him in some way. Socially, it's not wise to align yourself with Napoleonic values.
No, and he gets out. I'm sorry, I interrupted you. Please continue.
Well, just to put a period on the point is, yes, the French are fighting at Waterloo, but for a cause that is no longer French. And so Hugo's allegiances as an author are kind of divided.
Yeah, that makes sense. I do think you're right about that. And that's why the move toward emphasizing the role of Providence in all of this and connecting that role to the changing of the tides of history really gets him off the hook. I mean, if he had stopped with describing the English and describing the French, or describing the Allied powers and describing the Napoleonic powers in the scene, and then gotten us to that scene at the very end where the last little remnant of the old guard is completely surrounded by cannons, and they say, "Brave Frenchmen, surrender." And the Frenchman responds by saying, "Merde!" And they all die, right? And he talks about how this is the ultimate victory. The ultimate victory. Because it is a man standing up to his opponent and calling out the folly of the whole scenario. Why would we kill one another in such fashion? What good does it serve?
The fact that, that section is really interesting. And there are a couple places where I think we can draw some connections to our larger story. And that's one of them. The fact that he uses the word excrement that comes out at the end. That is this final victory. I see some irony in that. I'm not sure that he is saying, yes, this is the way one should behave. But instead that this is like Fantine falling, right? This is
right.
Like
I thought that too.
Yeah.
And the attitude of the Frenchman in this moment is to he calls it, he's sensing a lie within catastrophe. So doubly bitter. And this offer of relief is mockery. It's lying about the nature of their situation, the catastrophic suffering. He wants you to tell the truth and get it over with. And I definitely heard Fantine in her worst moments in that situation.
And so maybe a triumph of the human spirit, but the fact that it comes to this is to be mourned. Do you think?
Maybe, because it is put side by side with Napoleon, human genius struggling against divine destiny, if we accept Hugo's terms. So this sounds like a death throes of that human spirit. I'm not sure this is the human spirit that we should be putting all of our hope in, but it is courageous in its way.
Mm-hmm.
It's folly in the end. You're not as big as divine destiny, and God's going to have his way, but it's courageous. There's something about it that makes your spirit soar, you know?
Yeah, I want to read this. I want to read this bit. This is amazing stuff. And this is, by the way, what caused me, as I was reading along in our section for the week, to decide that, at least as it comes to narrating battles, I like Hugo better than Tolstoy.
Okay.
There, I've said it. Gauntlet down. Might it have been possible for Napoleon to win this battle? We answer no. Why? Because of Wellington? Because of Blucher? No. Because of God. And this is the part that makes me chuckle. I've made that argument. The only reason I lost today was because of God Almighty. Because of God. For Bonaparte to be conqueror at Waterloo was no longer within the law of the 19th century. Another series of acts was underway in which Napoleon had no place. The ill will of events had long been coming. It was time for this Titan to fall. The excessive weight of this man in human destiny disturbed the equilibrium. This individual alone counted for more than the whole of mankind. This plethora of all human vitality concentrated within a single head, the world rising to the brain of one man, would be fatal to civilization if it endured. The moment had come for incorruptible supreme equity to look into it. Probably the principles and elements on which regular gravitation in the moral and material orders depend had begun to mutter. Reeking blood, overcrowded cemeteries, weeping mothers, these are formidable plaintiffs. When the earth is suffering from a surcharge, there are mysterious moanings from the deeps that the heavens hear. Napoleon had been impeached before the infinite, and his fall was decreed. He annoyed God. Waterloo is not a battle. It is the changing face of the universe. That is great writing.
Yeah, it's so beautiful. And then he says, Napoleon annoyed God. And that part kind of...
It does rankle. There's something.
Rankles a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
That's where I think your point, Ian, about the national spirit, the suppressed national spirit kind of comes through.
Yeah, there's some of that in there.
But he otherwhere.
Well, and then but hold on, I want to finish the point and then I'll stop talking about it. But I finally figured out how to wrap it up and put a period on the end. It is that it's inconsistent. His view of this is, on the French side, what mattered was Napoleon's offense against God. All was noble in this battle, and all was perfect, and all was carried out to the very end, except God hated Napoleon, and it was time for Napoleon to lose. Hence the French defeat. But even in French defeat, we really actually won. And it was the activity of one little shepherd boy that sent the Prussian reinforcements to the right side of this ravine. And that's what actually caused us to lose. I mean, basically, we won. We more or less won, but God had to make sure Napoleon lost. That's what happens on the French side. On the English side, he says the very opposite of it's down to one man. He says it isn't Wellington that won the battle for the English. It was the English soldiers. The English soldiers did it, which sounds like he's giving the English soldiers a grave compliment, and probably he is, but it's hard not to notice the irony of that. On the one hand, the fate of France hinged on one man. On the other hand, the fate of England absolutely didn't hinge on one man, because the idea that there's a man greater than Napoleon, I mean, that's just hard to conscience. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I can see what you're arguing for sure. It didn't bother me the same way. What I came away with was, well, counter to your point, an appreciation for the place that Hugo is giving the English. Mm-hmm. He doesn't say in a salty way, which I came to expect from Tolstoy. He doesn't give backhanded compliments.
Right.
He actually acknowledges the English spirit and lauds the fact that they have some kind of memorial set up for them because the English did such an amazing thing, and he wants the English. Granted, he doesn't want a statue to Wellington. He wants a statue to the English as a nation. Yeah.
Right.
But I did think, as a historian who is French, well, not a historian, as an author who is French and speaking to the French people, he didn't have to do that necessarily.
Right.
And he
No, it's
did.
true.
And I wonder what purpose there is in that.
Yeah, and it is interesting. He's even-handed when it comes to his treatment of the tragedy of this battle, right?
And I wonder
The loss
if
of human life on both sides.
Yeah, I wonder if what we keep circling back to, this contrast between God and man, is more of what he's on about than the contrast between English and French. And that's an overstatement. I know. I'm sure he's talking about both. But when he says at the beginning of chapter 7, Napoleon in a good mood, he describes Napoleon. He says, the somber man of Austerlitz was cheerful at Waterloo. The greatest must display these contradictions. Our joys have shadows. The perfect smile belongs to God alone. That is not, he's using Napoleon as an example, but that statement is not about Napoleon. That's a statement about human nature and the finite perspective that an individual man has and the overarching purpose that divinity has for us. And that seems to be what he is trying to trace and wrestle through in his narration of Waterloo. It came from the very beginning. I heard that thread being pulled out as the way that we enter in to the story of Waterloo is through the natural scene, through the garden, and through the trees that still have all of the marks of this battle. And nature continues in a peaceful way, in a contented, peaceful, beautiful even scene. And there are scars of this violent altercation that happened there. And he's reliving all of the battle through the natural world that maintains and continues and is beautiful in spite of all of it. There's something about that I think is a contemplation of the God who made it all. I think he's really trying to get us to pit in our minds little tiny humanity and violence and destruction and suffering with the eternal of providence, of a creator, of the world that he made that's beautiful in spite of it. That's the larger conversation, I think, that I took away from the passage. What do you guys think about that?
Yeah, so in that vein, what do you make of the fact that he notices that men have reorganized the battlefield, that they have made a memorial to it, and when Wellington came back, he said, "This is not my battlefield." I don't think that he seems to be kind of taking Wellington's side on that there's something destructive about changing the landscape of this field.
I was going to say that too. And it extends actually all the way into the fate of the individual soldier in a really interesting way to me. Because one of the things he's on about is that a century and the tides of time and changing fate, and they're all directed by providence and et cetera, but the century doesn't care what you are railing against about it. It is going to do what it is going to do, right? The 19th century didn't have room for a Napoleon, and so Napoleon lost the Battle of Waterloo, despite the fact that he was in a superior position, actually pressed his troops at the right time, et cetera, right? Just so the century doesn't care about the actual details of the battle. The fact that it's called the Battle of Waterloo, except the whole battle happened 3 miles from Waterloo, and Waterloo wasn't even involved.
Just Waterloo 3 other towns who aren't known.
Right?
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. There's that. And then, but imagine for a second in your mind to connect it to the human element of the story, because this is the scene where Marius's father, Paul Merci, is drug out of the rubble by Thénardier. Right?
Spoiler alert, you guys. Paul Merci is going to be important.
Yeah, that's going to be a big deal. So, and I think it's really funny that he chose to narrate the entire Battle of Waterloo for this one moment. But I do think that thinking about the fate of this man will help us to understand the state of France. Because as Emily said, Napoleon's not in favor anymore, right? It's not fashionable. And so all of the men who gave their lives to Napoleon and were his trusted advisors and his best troops, who in any normal historical period would have come home as absolute war heroes and probably received positions on his court and et cetera, those guys come home outcasts. Right? And all of a sudden, the fact that they displayed the kind of heroism he gives us in this section, which is moving on both sides, right? It's moving on the English side, it's moving on the French side, absolute heroism, becomes a point against them. rather than a point for them. They actually, according to Hugo in this passage, exhibited the best things about being French.
Mhm.
And they still are rejected by history in this moment, and by their own nation in this moment. And that's I think for him, A, it's just the way things go, but B, it's a grave tragedy that we're swallowed up in all of that.
And I think that connects again to the social situations in France. And I think the great image of that in that section is the worst one of all the men falling into the road.
Sunken road.
Yeah.
And it just filling up, and the momentum forcing them into the pit that they can't, they're just being crushed by their own people. All of that, I think, is metaphorically significant for the larger ideas that he wants to talk about for the social and political situation in France.
Yeah. That was a really, really graphic scene. I'm trying to think if I've read anything quite as bone chilling as that.
Mm-hmm. I think this is a slight change of subject, but I can't think about the sunken road. If you guys want to talk about that, you can. But if I think about it, I will either cry or puke, neither of which is appropriate as the host of a podcast. But all of that's happening. That's what I'll say, out in the battlefield. And our entry point, though, into all of this violence and tragedy is a massacre in the chapel.
Mm-hmm.
And then the burning of this chapel. And there's mention of a crucifix or a sculpture of Christ that is not touched. In the face of all of this, the fire comes right up to his toes and doesn't
burn
the
him,
wooden Jesus. And I think that's significant. It's as significant to me in surviving the retelling of this story. It's as significant to me that Christ is not burned in this scenario as the natural imagery maintaining its beauty through the background of each of these scenarios. Those are the two hope points for me, as just as an emotional person reading through this scene. There is a steadiness and a divine presence in the retelling of this story that I know Hugo, the author, is putting there for us, but he gave me permission to look for it too, and I appreciated that.
What about the fact that also in that chapel, the infant Jesus's face is blown off?
Yeah.
I have
thought about that.
What's your thought? I have a thought too, but go ahead.
Well, what I noticed about that is that the suffering Jesus is the one that there's room for in a world full of sufferers. Maybe to flip it around, thinking about the infant Jesus will get us nowhere as sufferers, whereas meditating on the crucifix will
the man of sorrows.
Yeah, that's a man that can grapple with and can support the weight of a tragedy like the Battle of Waterloo or Borodino or Austerlitz, etc.
Well, yeah, the description of the battlefield comes to the image of a cross eventually. Right. Even the capital letter A has a cross inside it, and he emphasizes that this is kind of cruciform what's happening here. I don't know. What do you think about that, Emily?
Yeah, I like it. The fact that the outcome of the battle is he calls it the end of war, basically the end of battling nations. Napoleon is the last Caesar.
Oh yeah, that was a cool image.
What emerges are the thinkers, and there's that passage where he talks about today the great men of the nation. Let's see, it's page 342. He says, "Thank heaven, nations are great aside from the dismal ventures of the sword. Neither Germany nor England nor France is held in a scabbard. Nowadays, when Waterloo is merely a click of sabers, above Blucher, Germany has Goethe, and above Wellington, England has Byron. A vast rising of ideas is peculiar to our century, and in this dawning, England and Germany have their magnificent share. They are majestic because they think." If Waterloo is the hinge of this century, then
the Enlightenment is ushered in.
There's I'd love to unpack that a little bit, because it's the rise of ideas. There's the the contradiction that he makes between Napoleon being the liberal man who tended towards tyranny and the counter-revolution being a monarchical event that tends toward revolution. Everything, the death, I think the image that he's trying to make is a resurrection. Like out of the death rises this new life for the century.
Yeah.
Maybe.
Yeah, I definitely think that's true.
But then again, we think about where this is all going and the counter revolution, the rise of these, the fact that you can't put revolution down,
right,
is ultimately tragic.
It is. And then also, to take a step back from our novel and its context for a second, the statement that he's making about Napoleon being the last Caesar is kind of true, except also the hinge of the next century is going to be not one, but two wars larger than the Napoleonic Wars. So there's a sense in which he says the rise of ideas has taken over the warring of nations.
It's romantic.
And it's very romantic.
It's romantic, yeah.
And isn't true. And so we can weep for even deeper reasons than he is aware of at this point, because this was published in 1862, right?
Yeah. This is all very romantic. Romantic in the sense of overstated, like a balloon blown up with a principle, you know? He says the next sentence after what Emily was reading, I was just thinking on it. He says, the higher plane they, ideas, bring to civilization is intrinsic to them. It comes from themselves and not by accident. And at the end of that little section, he compares this intentional, not by accident kind of movement of a nation that's guided by ideas to battles determining man's future like a lottery ticket, just like chance. That rankled because it seemed to be the opposite of what he had just been arguing about a battle. This seemed to be a political statement rather than a theological statement, and he's strayed from his point. What do you guys think about that?
I mean, I kind of agree with you. I think that's part of what I was trying to get at earlier. He says more than one thing here, and some of the things are a little bit opposed. Personally, I think it's that he can't quite restrain his nationalism, and he also can't quite restrain his progressive political ideology.
Yeah, I don't think it's nationalism. I think it's the romanticism that
I think so too.
Always going to conflate. And to some extent, there's always going to be a conflation of his theology and his social cause.
Here,
by the way, we aren't trying to, and I'll let you guys keep talking here. We aren't trying to tell Hugo off for getting his ideology and his theology combined or confused, and we aren't trying to tell him that's an invalid thing to put in his novel. We are merely noticing it, right?
Right. We're trying to understand the various things that motivate him as an author. We've got thousands of pages left.
Right.
We want to understand the underpinnings of his particular romanticism, what drives him. This, I think Emily is right, that it's romanticism that he's on about right here. Listen to this phrase. Civilized nations, especially in our times, are neither exalted nor degraded by a captain's good or bad luck. Their specific importance in the human race results from something more than a combat. Their honor, thank God, their dignity, their light, their genius are not numbers that heroes and conquerors, those gamblers, can cast in the lottery of battles. Often, a battle lost is progress attained, less glory, more liberty. The drum is stilled, reason speaks. It is the game in which he who loses gains. So let us speak calmly of Waterloo on both sides. That definitely sounds like an Enlightenment spirit and a romantic reading for a purpose.
I would agree with that.
And yet he is able to say on page 350, he makes the observation, what difference does it make to the infinite? This entire tempest, this vast cloud, this war, then this peace, all of this darkness, do not disturb for one moment the light of that infinite eye, before which the smallest insect leaping from one blade of grass to another equals the eagle flying from spire to spire among the towers of Notre Dame. So Ian, you were using the language of it not mattering to nature, or maybe Megan was
I
making
think
that
that was
point,
me. Yeah.
but and he uses that here too. What does it matter to the infinite? And so it feels like apathy, but then the comparison he makes between the smallest insect jumping from one blade of grass to the next, that's such an intimate detail that the infinite eye notices. And the fact that he transitions from this grand narration of Waterloo and says, like, let us remain calm, but then gives us at the very end this tiny portrait of the scum of the earth scouring the battlefields.
Well,
and this one man.
Yes, one man being pulled out of that pile of dead bodies, and his life is saved. He's just plucked out of that situation, and there's a trajectory from there that our whole story kind of comes from. I love that image. I think you're absolutely right. It's the infinite putting in perspective this great conflict, but also noticing and feeling intimately the human experience in it. It's very different from, this is a completely different author. We haven't mentioned him yet today, but Stephen Crane's The Red Badge of Courage talks about battle and nature, that same kind of duality. And the natural world in that story is apathetic towards man's plight, is utterly nihilistic and feels nothing. There's no intimate connection to mankind in that story at all. So I think you're right. That's a presence in this retelling that's significant.
I think it's what makes it, the novel so far at least, great, is that he is doing the kind of Tolstoy project. He's narrating for us the movement as he sees it of the 19th century towards ideals, towards the thinking man, towards revolution, but and that's very impersonal. And it doesn't have anything to do with the Napoleon or Wellington, right? They're just like Tolstoy, they're just players. They're a multiplicity of causes. They're one of them leading towards this progression. But in the midst of that, the infinite plucks one man out of that and rescues him. And it's not social, it's not political, it's personal. It's a personal salvation, and it's performed at the hand of a villain,
right?
The worst of the worst is the one who rescues this man. And like, maybe that is the cast to think about this whole battle over. This is tragic, it's ugly, it's suffering, it's terrible, and yet what comes out of it is rescue.
I love that.
Personal rescue.
Yeah, it's really good. I also noticed in the way that this whole battle is put together, and this might be maybe too vague a comment, but he begins he tells it in waves, which is also kind of like a battle, right? Battles go in movements like that. But he starts by giving us the story of the orchard, which is teeny tiny. There
in 3 acts.
Yeah. Gives us the story of the orchard, which was, I mean, oh my goodness, you guys. It reads like a short story, a thrilling short story. I mean, it's the writing was so good. But so he gives us this little teeny tiny picture, and then it gets bigger, and then it gets bigger, and then it gets bigger. And pretty soon we're zoomed out looking at the entire battlefield over the course of, 3 miles or whatever it is. And then he jumps from that bird's eye view of the battle to the philosophical ideas and to the hand of providence and to the movement of the 19th century. And it strikes me that's the project of his whole novel in miniature. He's looking at the details of Cosette's life, this tiny little waif of a girl with no mother who lives on the street, and making of that a metaphor for the very largest, highest, biggest things, not just for the fate of a nation and for the movement of a century, but also the way that God deals with all of those things. And that's cool. I think it's a beautiful microcosm of his project.
I agree 100%. And I wouldn't forget that it comes back down, actually, that the shape of the chapter is back down towards the particular, because otherwise, I don't know, Cosette becomes like a
prop.
An analogy. What's the word I'm looking for?
Well, if we ended up here in the heavens with the bird's eye view, then we would be tempted to think that that infinite is indifferent, but it isn't. We're not allowed to think that because it
Right.
swoops back down again
Yeah.
into the intimate and the personal.
That's good. I like that a lot.
Well, you know, if one were to summarize this chapter, I think that nobody does it better than ABBA. You know, my. At Waterloo, Napoleon did surrender. And now I feel that I've met my match in much a similar way.
Oh my goodness. Are you going to give us a dramatic?
I love it. Keep going.
The missing number from the Les Mis musical. They cover. They don't touch on the historical elements. They should have.
They should have.
Waterloo, I was defeated. You won the war.
Well, thank you all for your attention, and thank both of you for your brilliance. This has been a delightful conversation.
Hey, before we sign off, for those who, and I am speaking to all of our listeners who didn't make it through this section because what the heck is happening? Where did Jean Valjean go? In the last 3 pages of our section for today is when something significant and plot-oriented happens. And maybe we should summarize it really quick, just in case. I mean, I'm not saying there are lots of them, but I think there might be. We skip through this section looking for the characters we recognize. Quick summary. Thénardier is basically a grave robber who follows along behind. This is like pre-Cosette. He's a young man, but he follows along behind the army like a crow, stripping dead bodies and making a fortune off the dead guys. And he sees this hand sticking up out of a pile of bodies that has a gold ring on it. And in stripping the ring off the hand, he realizes the man is alive. And he pulls him out to rob him of all of the rest of his things and kind of coincidentally saves his life. That man who he has saved is going to be significant, and his name is Pontmercy. Is there anything else we need to say about that?
No, but it's, well, yeah, it's a very Dickensian moment, right? And it's all, they're all masters of the same century, but the fact that our minor characters all are related to each other in some providential way, very, very Dickens.
Yeah. Anyway, I just didn't want us to go without helping out those members of our group who aren't reading this for the Battle of Waterloo, and that was not what they wanted this week.
I have heard that this is the longest digression in the novel. That, of course, there are more coming. Of course, the sewers of Paris are coming, but this is the longest one. So we made it.
Woohoo!
It wasn't
Congrats,
that
dudes.
bad. I think that it wasn't as bad as War and Peace. I think we're going to be fine.
No, I agree.
Could it be that we read it faster? Could that be part of it?
It could be, but also it could be, and this is not to cast a dire pall on the rest of the show, but it could be that it wasn't that bad because it is essentially a narrative about a battle instead of being
it's
a
not
narrative about sewers. I don't think that's a thing.
What? Oh, no.
We'll see. We got to trust Hugo.
Here's the
we have
drama
to hew to Hugo,
of the man who laid out the Paris sewers.
I think that it's nice that Hugo isn't trying to create a new genre or like a new form, right? This is a novel, and I tentatively trust him to keep it a novel at this point.
Well,
yeah, me too.
I am absolutely loving it. I will also give my trust over to Hugo, and we hope the rest of you will continue to join us as we plot our way through Les Misérables. Thank you both for being here. Thank all of you listeners again for joining us today, and we'll see you next time around on How to Eat an Elephant. Bon appetit.
Bon appetit.
Bon appetit.